We've seen misinformation in many forms over the years, whether it's been climate change denial, white supremacy, COVID misinformation, anti-vaccine, medical hoaxes, flat earth, QAnon, the resurrection of dead political candidates, the list goes on and on. The spread of these false narratives and harmful ideas has created a digital landscape where truth has become increasingly difficult to distinguish from fiction. This has had real-world consequences, affecting everything from public health to political stability. In the early days of social media, companies didn't do much to police their sites, but over time, as the internet grew and users began to spread all sorts of content, the companies started cracking down. Major platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube began deplatforming users who shared harmful misinformation, including conspiracy theorists, hate groups, and extremists. They took down accounts that were involved in election fraud claims or spreading COVID-19 misinformation. For a while, it seemed like social media companies were making a real effort to clean up their platforms. However, in recent years, we've seen a shift. After the initial flurry of deplatforming and suspensions, some platforms have started reversing course, loosening up restrictions, and even allowing certain controversial figures back. Twitter, for example, went through major overhauls when Elon Musk took over and famously reinstated several previously banned accounts, including Donald Trump, citing for a push for free speech. Now, whether Elon Musk is the go-to role model for the push for free speech is another thing. However, the anti-censorship movement still continues. Deplatforming, in definition, refers to the act of removing or restricting someone's access to a platform, typically social media, due to the contents they're sharing. This can mean banning users, deleting posts, or suspending entire accounts. The idea behind it is to prevent harmful, misleading, or dangerous content from spreading on the platform. With all that aside, let's finally go over the arguments. Do social media companies have a moral obligation to censor misinformation? Let us start with the first side. Social media companies have no moral ground to deplatform users. Deplatforming poses a moral problem because it infringes on the principle of personal autonomy, the right of individuals to make their own decisions about what to say, hear, and believe. Social media platforms have become essential spaces for public discourse, much like the town squares of ye olden days. When companies remove users or content, they are essentially deciding on behalf of individuals what is acceptable to engage with. This undermines people's abilities to think critically and form their own opinions, which is a fundamental aspect of personal freedom. Imagine a library where certain books are removed from the shelves, not because they're illegal or dangerous, but because the librarian decides they might contain ideas that some readers could misinterpret. This would be seen as an overreach, as it assumes that readers cannot evaluate the material for themselves. Similarly, when social media companies deplatform users, they take on the role of these gatekeepers, determining what ideas are too harmful for others to encounter. This approach treats users of social media as incapable of navigating complex or controversial topics. However, the less complex and controversial topics people come into contact with, the worse they will be at critically engaging with inevitable other topics like that in the future. The effects of deplatforming extend beyond just limiting access to information. It also sends a message that certain voices are not worth hearing, which can alienate individuals and communities. While the concept of censorship of misinformation works in a vacuum, it doesn't work in our society, which is driven by capitalistic intentions and greed. A bunch of billionaires get to decide what you can and can't say on social media. Why? Because under our current system, these platforms are run by profit-hungry giants more concerned with their shareholders than actually letting us speak freely. They've got the power to decide what's true and what's misinformation, or whether you even see it. Remember, it's not about protecting us from lies, it's about keeping power and profits in the hands of a tiny elite. Let's look at a specific example. Particular keywords like #lesbian or #bisexual have heavily enforced content filters, regularly leaving out LGBTQ+ creators, artists, and activists. In addition, platforms such as Instagram frequently label LGBTQ+ content as sexually explicit or sensitive content, leading to censorship to greater populations. The censorship of search filters and content are done to protect the corporation's profits due to LGBTQ+ issues being seen as divisive, both on domestic and international levels. This censorship isn't just person to person, it's geopolitical, with many websites censoring the topic altogether in other countries. This shows how censorship can be abused to protect profits, even when the content isn't even misinformation. These companies censor content not to keep us safe, but to protect their profits. So in the end, it's less about fighting misinformation and more about making sure billionaires don't gain control over the freedom of expression. With censorship, we are entrusting the burden of truth keepers to fallible people with personal interests and biases. Even the most unbiased person in the world would still lean one direction or another on something, and that has the capacity to taint the campaign against misinformation. Remember, not all misinformation is necessarily purposeful or outright lies. Sometimes it's just misunderstanding or a harmless, albeit incorrect fact. The risk is that, instead of a platform that encourages diverse thought, we end up with a sanitized version of reality where only certain voices are allowed to be heard, those that align with the interests of the few. Now let's consider the other side of the argument. Social media companies do have the moral responsibility and obligation to deplatform users. While the use of censorship can be harmful to groups or ideas, arguably the lack of censorship can have just as great, if not greater, consequences. According to slides presented by an internal Facebook team to company executives in 2018, Facebook acknowledged that their algorithms exploit the human's brain attraction to divisiveness, and warned that the algorithms would promote more and more divisive content in an effort to gain user attention and increase time on the platform. In this way, social media companies are actually encouraged to promote misinformation, to create division and increase user attention. A lack of censorship is inherently designed to create conflict and turmoil in society, all with the end goal of increased profits. This also serves to demonstrate how misinformation can lead to social division, as people create false worldviews and hatred towards other groups based on information that isn't true, which can be seen in groups such as white nationalists. These policies create real-world consequences by putting people in harm's way, whether that may be mass shootings, terrorist attacks, or election fraud. Misinformation rarely exists in isolation. It grows and evolves, creating a cascade of increasingly harmful ideas that can spread rapidly across social media. What may begin as seemingly harmless misinformation, like flat Earth theories, can act as a gateway to far more dangerous movements such as QAnon. Flat Earth communities, which promote distrust in science and institutions, normalize the skepticism of authority. This skepticism doesn't remain confined to debates about the shape of the Earth, however. It expands into broader conspiracies that undermine the trust in our government, media, and experts. QAnon is a prime example of how misinformation can escalate. Emerging from similar mechanisms of distrust and echo chambers, QAnon has propagated baseless claims about a global cabal of satanic pedophiles and has been directly linked to real-world violence, including armed attacks. Both Flat Earth and QAnon thrive on the same social media algorithms that amplify sensational content, creating an environment where falsehoods gain traction and mutate into even more harmful ideology. Deplatforming plays a critical role in breaking this cycle. By removing the channels through which misinformation spreads, these platforms can prevent these ideas from gaining momentum and evolving into dangerous movements. It's not just about addressing individual pieces of content, it's about disrupting the conditions that allow this kind of misinformation to spiral out of control. Without intervention, these false narratives can dominate online spaces, eroding more trust in institutions and leading to actual harm in the real world. Now, let's examine the issue from an epistemic perspective. When evaluating whether social media companies should deplatform users, it's important to consider not just the content of the information being shared, but also the credibility and context surrounding it. This is where the concept of higher order evidence comes into play. Higher order evidence refers to information about the reliability or credibility of a source, rather than the direct arguments or data, known as first order evidence. Consider this example. If a controversial figure, known for spreading climate change denial, is given a prominent platform on social media, or invited to speak at a prestigious institution, the act of granting them visibility itself becomes the higher order evidence. It suggests to audience that their views are credible or worth considering, even if their arguments lacked factual basis. This can amplify the misinformation by lending it undue legitimacy. In such cases, deplatforming can be morally justified as a way to prevent harmful ideas from gaining unwanted credibility. Our third and final perspective suggests that social media companies do not have a moral responsibility to deplatform harmful content, but they are allowed to do so if they so choose. The argument here is that these companies should not be morally compelled to act as judges of truth or ethics. Instead, they should have the autonomy to determine what content aligns with their platform's values and goals. For example, during the 2020 US presidential election, Facebook faced criticism for allowing political ads accused of spreading misinformation. Despite the backlash, Facebook chose not to tweak its algorithm or remove these ads. This decision reflects the balance Facebook was trying to lead between maintaining its policies and avoiding accusations of censorship. Also, it highlights the challenges of moderating content at such a large scale and the difficulty of determining what qualifies as harmful. Given the sheer volume of misinformation and harmful content spreading daily, it would be nearly impossible for platforms to remove everything. The bigger issue lies in defining what is truly harmful versus what should remain permissible under free expression, a highly complex task. While deplatforming may sometimes seem like a necessary action, it doesn't mean that it is morally justifiable in every case. Ultimately, while social media companies may not have a moral obligation to censor content, they do have the freedom to make those decisions within the boundaries of their platform's policies. In conclusion, given the arguments presented, our team finds it clear that some censorship should be morally obligated at a minimum. It comes down to this moral question: what will have the greater moral consequences? Putting the power and responsibility of free speech regulation in the hands of corporations, or will the effects of no regulation lead to a greater catastrophe? Ultimately, after looking at both sides, we came to the conclusion that social media companies do in fact have a moral obligation to censor content. The widespread harm which misinformation causes is evident in cases such as QAnon, and in the potential abuse of misinformation for profits at the expense of public safety. While censorship has its own risk, we concluded that the risk to the lives and safety of people when misinformation is allowed to spread outweighs the potential risk of suppression of speech.